introduce Delia Baldassarri once again to a Cornell audience. And Delia, just to give you a sense of the proportion of her contribution to sociology, she only got her PhD in two fields. The first one from the University of Trento in 2006, and the second from the Columbia University in 2007, with two very different dissertations. And she has, in this period, contributed leading articles and books in a number of subfields of sociology: political sociology, economic sociology, social networks, collective action and cooperation, public opinion and political behavior, and human decision-making. So it's really a huge range that she has been probably the leading sociologist in shaping and defining the future of sociology in these areas and broader. And what we're very pleased about is that Delia has been a very active member of the Center for the Study of Economy and Society and its intellectual community. She's a fellow of the center and has participated in a whole range of workshops, symposiums, and seminar series, both in Ithaca and in New York City. And Delia has won many awards. It's incredible how many awards she has won. But among them are the Roger Gould Prize from the American Journal of Sociology and the Best Book Award for Simple Art of Voting, which is a revised book based on her dissertation at Trento. And just to give you a sense of the range of the work, in 2020, she published articles on diversity and prosocial behavior in science, strangers in hostile lands, exposure of refugees and right-wing support, gender discrimination against immigrants based on experimental evidence, market integration accounts for local variation in generalized altruism. It goes on, micro relations of urban governance, and was there a culture war? And this is just in 1 year. And they're all very interesting articles. I haven't yet read them, but I've looked at the abstracts. Now, she's best known for her many articles, which were published in the American Journal of Sociology and the American Sociological Review. And here you see the main areas where she's providing intellectual leadership and defining the field of research. But it's in political sociology and networks, lab in the field experiments on prosocial behavior, very important to economic sociology, voting behavior, ethno-racial diversity, and effect on trust. And this is a very important article, in my view, because she and her co-author at Pascal overturned a widely held belief that the greater the diversity of race and ethnicity of race in society, the less there is trust in civil society. And it was very important to overturn this view, basically reanalyzing the same data set that Robert Putnam used to report this finding. So it's in this area that she will be presenting today, based on field experiments in Italy. The title of the talk is Between In-Group Selection and Economic Interdependence. So we're really delighted to have Delia join us today to present her most recent research.
Delia, you're muted. I
Can't
think.
hear you. You're muted.
Here we go. Like after a full year, I've not learned lesson number 1, which is unmute yourself. Okay, thanks, Victor, for a very generous interaction, and thanks to everybody for participating in yet another Zoom meeting. I mean, it's quite remarkable how many meetings we have been dealing with these days. So I really appreciate for people taking the time. So I am actually going to present some work from a broader set of research that I've done, in which I was generally interested in understanding how solidarity and cooperation emerge from in complex societies, in societies that are not held together by the classical mechanical solidarity a la Durkheim. And in this work, give me 1 second. Yep. Okay. For some reason, when I have a big screen, yep. This is. Okay, now it's working. Okay, so this actually is works sponsored by the ERC and in collaboration with Joanna Jarecki and Max Schaub, who were postdocs on this big grant and then went on to have wonderful careers in Germany in this case. And it started out from an empirical observation, which is that most Western European countries and North American countries have experienced a big increase in the migrant stock in the last 25 years. And this in itself has triggered a huge literature that has essentially identified a negative association between ethnic heterogeneity and collective outcomes, in this case, self-reported trust, political participation, and other measures of social capital. And building on this negative association, they have started to argue that diversity, increased diversity, might lead to negative outcomes for the collectivity. Now, there has been also a fair amount of criticism. I'm talking here about like hundreds of articles on the topic, exploring this correlation. There are like a fair amount of criticisms. What actually struck me of this literature is how easily it got the attention of almost everybody in the social sciences. And the reason is that it does make somehow intuitive sense to expect that like increased diversity reduces collective outcomes and the capacity of a society, community, and so on to cooperate. And the reason why it's intuitive is because we kind of hold in our mind a communitarian conception of trust and social capital, which is based on social homogeneity and similarity. And in this framework, it makes total sense to obviously believe that cohesive groups and close-knit networks facilitate the emergence of trust, reciprocity, shared norms. There are plenty of works, starting from Coleman in sociology, making this argument. And therefore, when actually society or a community becomes more diverse, it makes sense to just expect the shared norms to become less shared, networks to become more fragmented, and therefore that capacity to create trust might actually be undermined. However, there is also an alternative view of how prosociality is created, and it goes back to Durkheim. In his view, in societies that are differentiated, that experience heterogeneity and processes of individualization, prosociality relies on interdependence and division of labor, much more than cultural similarity and mutual acquaintanceship. So essentially, my take on the debate on the effects of diversity on social capital switched a bit from essentially thinking in terms of the loss of homogeneity, which is the type of thinking that most people seem to be hold on to the Durkheimian observation, which is like, okay, we live in complex societies. There might be different ways in which solidarity and cooperation comes about. And so I started like to investigate this question. And my research question became, in very general terms, how does prosocial behavior extend beyond in-group boundaries in multi-ethnic societies? Because this is the core element for prosociality to become generalized. And therefore, I moved away from the classical framework, which is to compare homogeneous groups toward heterogeneous groups and communities, to study big cities and the behavior of people in multi-ethnic context. And in fact, what I'm going to present today is a study of how essentially natives, in this case, Italian natives and immigrants, interact in a series of interaction settings in the city of Milan. And the core question becomes like, what drives, in this case, both the selection of the partners you interact with and the behavior in these various interactions. To give you a general sense of the direction in which the theory here is moving. Remember, like Durkheim theorized the importance of economic interdependence and division of labor. And I do have the belief that actually he's after something very important. What I kind of think is that crossing in-group outgroup boundaries is not an instinctive thing for humans. Humans have an innate tendency to stick to the in-group. So interacting with outgroup, with people from different ethnic groups, might not be natural, is not natural. There are behavioral reasons for why this is not the case. However, people in contemporary urban settings cannot satisfy their material needs within their familiar networks. You move to any city, like you'll have inevitably to interact, to hire, to work for people from different ethnic groups. The bus driver, the car driver, the computer programmer, and anybody else might very easily be from a different ethnic group. So people are essentially pushed outside their comfort zones to constructively interact with unknown others. And my intuition is that this enhanced frequency of interactions with outgroup members will end up contributing to normalize the experiences and therefore be conducive to greater generalized prosociality. Where does this idea come from? There is a few studies that are supporting these intuitions. So there is this line of research by a group of anthropologists, economists, and other social science disciplines that have started to study variation in prosocial behavior across societies. And their question was like, what explains greater levels of trust and solidarity in some communities than others? And what they found, very interestingly, was that individual level economic and demographic variables did not explain prosocial behavior. What did explain prosocial behavior and differences in behavior across these various societies, which range from like hunter-gatherers communities to like more like urban communities in developed countries, was the level of market integration. So how much people rely on market exchange in their daily life. And what they found is that the more people were integrated in markets, the more they were willing to trust an unknown other. And the idea here is that the more frequently people experience market transactions, the more they will also experience abstract sharing principles concerning behaviors towards strangers. And there are similar intuitions in sociology. I'm thinking here about the work of Kazu Yamagishi on the emancipatory theory of trust, in which he essentially observed that there is greater generalized trust in individualistic societies like the US compared to collectivistic societies like Japan. And the idea is that the intense group ties that are typical of Japanese society prevent trust from developing beyond group boundaries. And there is another set of interesting studies by Ermisch and Gambetta, in which they embedded experimental work in surveys that show that essentially people who are less embedded in family networks or have experienced uprooting events are more likely to trust strangers. So in all these instances, both like the market integration hypothesis, as well as this emancipatory theory of trust, the idea is that people are pushed by structural, by external factors to go beyond the boundaries of their familiar networks. And once they are pushed, they actually experience positive interactions and they are fine, and they develop greater generalized trust. I also happened to do some work at the macro level in this area, and I was able to actually account for variations in prosocial behavior, in this case in a lost letter experiment, and in a context of a developed society, Italy. And I was able to show that indeed variation in prosocial behavior is explained even within a single society by levels of market integration. And this actually explains behavior of prosocial behavior, not only toward in-group members, other Italians in this case, but also toward the immigrants. So what we get from these empirical evidence with respect to my research question, which is about cooperation in ethnically diverse settings, is that essentially external factors might facilitate intergroup contact. And in particular, economic interdependence is a primary force that might create opportunities for contact. And therefore, this suggests that we need to pay greater attention to strategic interaction. Most research either like relies on general questions about trust or like measures of altruism, while if Durkheim is right and this previous research is right, like the place in which intergroup contact in complex societies occurs, one of the primary places might be the economic domain. And here, what drives people's behavior is strategic consideration. So it's in that type of dynamics that we need to focus on. And the underlying aspect that is assumed by this set of theories, but is not really like proved by this previous scholarship, is that once people from different ethnic groups get in contact, positive outcomes will derive, and therefore, like we could actually expect that exposure leads to greater generalized prosociality. So these theories just assume that like the contact is in itself positive. However, there is a bunch of research in psychology which suggests that contact could be positive, but it could also be not. So I switch now to that type of considerations which are relevant in order to really believe in this idea that economic interdependence and division of labor might actually be positive for producing a generalized prosociality. So the general ideas we get from social psychology can be very quickly summarized in the findings of contact theory, which I assume everybody is familiar with, where the idea is that sustained positive interactions with outgroup members reduce prejudice. And this happens especially under optimal circumstances of equal status, common goal, and supportive institutional environment. Now, contact theory has been quite criticized by subsequent scholars, in part because like contact never occurs under these ideal circumstances, but it often happens in context of competition over scarce resources. And according to other scholars, when contact occurs under these conditions, group threat and conflict might be exacerbated. So contact might actually lead to the opposite outcome. On top of this, we also want to keep in mind, again, from general social psychology, the basic findings of social identity theory, which is that in-group favoritism is a staple of human behavior. People would actually tend to prefer, favor, stick to the in-group. Some authors would actually also suggest that people would develop like negative sentiments toward the out-group. But even if we don't assume that, we would actually still like experience a certain level of discrimination toward out-group members. just based on the fact that there is an innate tendency to favor the in-group. Now, what does scholarship more specifically in the area of ethnic diversity and contact suggest is slightly different. So essentially, like, there is a series of more recent studies that have exploited randomized assignment to, let's say, mixed versus homogeneous schools or soccer teams, or actually implemented randomization, and has studied the basic tenets of contact theory, meaning whether people are actually going to experience lower prejudice and have more positive interaction outcomes with outgroup members if they experience mixed groups. And this scholarship actually is leading to the notion that essentially when people are thrown into schools, soccer teams, assigned to roommates of a different ethnic group in the army or university dorms, in all these settings, the evidence seems to be that the outcome is greater tolerance of outgroup, greater likelihood of having friends from a different ethnic groups, or and also higher performance, and sometimes also some kind of satisfaction overall. So the idea here is that there is some evidence, good, high-quality experimental evidence suggesting that purposeful interaction in a variety of social or occupational settings might lead to greater intergroup prosociality. So somehow confirming the contact theory. However, we also have now decades of research in using auditor correspondence studies or large data sets of observational data that suggests that there is persistent discrimination of outgroup members, people of color in the US, as well as like various types of immigrants in Europe, in a bunch of settings, hiring, housing, and or other types of markets. So one might actually think that these two types of findings might be in contrast. But actually, it's important to observe that they concern two different aspects of interaction dynamics. So the first tells us what people do when they are forced, randomly assigned into specific interaction settings, while the second set of findings tell us what people do when they have the opportunity to choose who they are going to sublet their apartment to, who are they going to hire. And this actually is an important distinction, this element of choice versus what people do when they are interacting with somebody, that is actually rarely considered in studies of discrimination, in studies of the effects of diversity, and so on. In addition to these, but related, there is a third element, then I will actually try to connect all of them. There is a third element, which is the role of social networks and previous experiences. So several scholars have actually suggested that diverse social networks have an important mediating role. So people who live in diverse communities and have a diverse network of friends have higher levels of prosociality, against the finding that people living in diverse communities have lower levels of trust and prosociality. If they also have diverse social networks, they have higher levels. And many scholars have suggested that segregation rather than diversity might negatively affect prosocial attitudes. And segregation might be imposed, or in large cases is just like a byproduct of individual choices. So, and there is a fair amount of evidence that individuals do self-select into diverse versus homogeneous communities, groups, and social networks. So what I'm trying to build here is I'm actually complexifying the idea of contact. The classical social psychological studies just like drop people in a lab. Other studies became more sophisticated and like used like real settings and randomly assigned people to settings. However, in general, when we think about contact, we need to think about three different stages. One is the external exogenous preconditions, and it's what I mentioned before when I was, for instance, talking about like the role of economic interdependence in pushing people to interact with each other, or for instance, living in a diverse neighborhood. Then there is the role of choice, like individuals' willingness to interact with non-coethnics, and the type of diversity that one's network would actually develop. So if people start interacting with non-coethnics and experience positive interaction, then like they might actually increase their likelihood to interact with other non-coethnics. So exposure might actually be greater later on. And then the third stage of contact is what people oftentimes study in labs, which is the actual behavior and purposeful interaction when people are stuck together in a situation. And what I'm trying to do in the research that I'm about to present is to keep in mind some aspects of the external preconditions, although it's very hard to manipulate them much. And then like zoom in on both the role of contact and what people do in specific interaction settings. And this will actually be useful in order to understand how intergroup contact might actually lead to greater prosociality or not. What we did in practice to implement some of these ideas is to essentially do some sort of study, X-ray of social behavior in different types of interactions, studying a population of both Italian natives and immigrants. And what we did was to actually select people who lived in diverse neighborhoods, which by our definition were neighborhoods in Milan, which had a rate of immigration higher than 12%, which is the average. And we ended up actually including many neighborhoods. There is not a huge level of segregation in Italy in general and in Milan in particular. So we got a bunch of people, both Italians and also Filipinos and Moroccans, which are two groups that are quite well represented in the immigrant population in the city. And in the end, we got like Italians who on a daily basis do experience interacting with people on the streets. 60% of them report having at least 2 or more acquaintances that are immigrants, and 40% reports having more than 2 immigrant friends, and only 30%, however, do work with with immigrants. The workplace is still quite segregated in some ways. Many of them report meeting them on the streets. We also excluded a few areas from our sample where the immigration rate was above 30%, because we were worried about like getting extreme cases, but we are really talking about 2 neighborhoods. So what we did was actually to bring these people in small groups, in groups of 6, to a lab in the center of Milan, and have a series of activities, both on the using a screen and with each other. And today I'm gonna actually describe the results of some of these activities. The things that we had in mind in setting up this study were the following. Before, I did mention the importance of studying interdependence of social action and considering not only situations in which we are looking at simple solidarity or altruism, but also the behavior and strategic interaction. Because if really solidarity derives from economic interdependence, we really want to know what people do, not only in situations in which they are donating goods or clothes, but also in situations in which they are deciding whether to hire or somebody or to send their kids to let's say, mixed school, for instance. So what we did was to play a dictator game in order to capture behavior in non-strategic interactions, and instead have people participate to a trust and competence game, and we'll explain the games later, in order to capture strategic interactions. And by strategic, I mean like interactions in which people take into account what others would do in order to decide their own best course of action. The second thing that we did was to actually provide an identity of alter. These are games in which people interact with one or more other people, in order to provide a profile of the subject that is not simply their ethnic identity or their nationality, but also information about their economic and social integration in the city. Again, going back to the idea that like division of labor is an important aspect of society. And then we also included like different ethnic groups because we could not just assume that people behave the same way toward a generic immigrant. So we included people from different countries of origin. And finally, we studied contacting both in terms of people's choice to interact with others, as well as their actual behavior in interaction. Now, the first set of studies, I'm just moving toward describing the results. Now, the experiments and the results. I don't have hypotheses for the good reason that some hypotheses are embedded in the experimental design. But in general, this study was intended as an X-ray of prosocial behavior, in the sense that we wanted to explore, map what's the behavior toward co-ethnics and non-co-ethnics in different interaction settings. So we didn't have strong opinions on whether Italians would actually be more generous toward in-group or out-group members. For instance, in a dictator game or a trust game, we want to measure that. We want to see how that goes. We have hypotheses, of course, about the importance of showing embeddedness in economic life, for instance, which I would touch upon when I describe the experiments. So the first game that we played is a dictator game, which is usually used in order to measure levels of overall altruism. And the game goes this way. The participant and another person receives a total of 10 euros, which is around $12 right now for the activity. The task is to decide how to split this money between the person and the other participant, and people can choose to keep the full amount for themselves, or to give the other participant some part of it, or to give any amount in between. And everything that is decided to keep is the decider's money, and whatever they decide to give is the other person, and this decision is anonymous. And people are then like presented with the situation for these activities. We have been paired with, in this case, Chiara, who lives in Milan, was born in Lombardia, which is the Milan region, and is 25 years old. And then we asked them to decide how to allocate the money. And both the Italians and the immigrants participated in this activity. So the findings, are the following. So here you actually first see how much Italians decide to give to members of the in-group, meaning other Italians, and to members of the out-group, which is one of the various other ethnic groups they were paired with. And the same for Filipinos and Moroccans. But in all cases, like purple is the in-group and the light blue is the out-group. And you can easily see that on average, they give like little less than 4 euros out of 10. And it's more or less the same amount for all the groups. And there is no distinction between in-group and out-group members. Now, if we look into the Italians group, and Italians were paired with either a Peruvian or a Filipino or a Romanian, a Moroccan, Chinese, So we do see that actually there is no distinction in terms of specific nationalities. People actually tend on average to give the same amount, and they don't discriminate. Now, if we look at subsets of the population, I can tell you that essentially 60% of participants give the same amount both when they are paired with a co-ethnic and when they are paired with a non-coethnic. Every participant did both. They were both paired with a co-ethnic and non-coethnic. And this was also randomized, so the order doesn't really matter here. So 60% give the same amount. However, like there is a good 20% that gives more to the co-ethnic and a good 20% that gives more to the non-coethnic. And when we look into this, we do obviously find, as you might expect, that Italians who have positive views about immigrations are more generous toward outgroup members. Italians that are against immigration are less generous. Italians who have immigrant friends give more to outgroup members on average than Italians who don't. So essentially, the game works. On average, there is no real distinction, but it's picking up on levels of altruism. As I said before, however, like this is just measuring non-strategic interactions, just overall level of solidarity. More interesting for our story is what people would do in strategic interactions. And so the second type of activities was a trust game. In a trust game, people receive 10 euros, both participants, and the first participant gets 10 euros and the other participants does not. And the first participant has to decide if and how much he or she wants to give to the other person. And then we will triple that amount. And then the other participant will decide how much to send back, if anything. In this case, people were paired again with either an in-group or out-group member. Here you have an example of someone who was paired with Farida, who lives in Milan, was born in Morocco, is 52, and interesting, like works in elderly care. So in this set of strategic games, we started to introduce information about the economic and social embeddedness of people in the economic life of the city. In particular, what we gave as an information in addition to where the person was born, age, and gender was whether they like to watch TV or go on walks, whether they volunteer at the local church or mosque, whether they have, a factory job, they work in our elderly care or are a class representative. So we provide some information about the individual that went beyond simply the nationality. And what we found in terms of how much Italians decide to give in a trust game to the outgroup member is that the nationality of the outgroup member does not matter. Or sorry, the nationality of the person they are paired with does not matter in their decision of how much to send in a trust game. Some like signs of embeddedness in the social and economic life do have a strong positive effect. So like volunteering in a religious institution, working in elderly care, mothers in other settings also having a factory job and so on. So from this, we actually do conclude that in a trust game, which is actually a strategic setting in which the first mover has to evaluate the trustworthiness, guess the trustworthiness of the other person. We actually found that the nationality of the person they are paired with is not relevant. Controlling for everything else you can obviously imagine, while like embeddedness is. Now we are going to actually look at a slightly different thing. So half of our sample was indeed paired with another participant and played the trust game. The other half of our set of participants was instead presented with a trust game. And then they were told, you can choose between an Italian who loves to watch TV or go on walks, or you can choose someone else who could be either Italian or immigrant, who, and then like had a bunch of things, either have jobs or volunteer at the local mosque. So here we are actually looking at the choice component. We are actually gonna like do the same thing, like play this trust game, but this group of people are given the choice of the opportunity to select who to play with. And when we look at the selection, we do see that immigrants are less likely to be chosen, significantly less so, as well as signs of engagement with the social and civic life are all positive boosts over people who like to watch TV. So in like when faced with the same task of like playing a game, the subset of people who were given the opportunity of choosing, they did show a preference for the group member. However, the people who were not given this opportunity behaved in the game in the same way toward an in-group and out-group member. And again, like here they are like thinking in terms of trustworthiness. And we have a very similar finding in a second type of game that is again a strategic interaction game, in which the evaluation, the consideration about altruism is not about trustworthiness, but is about competence. So in this game, people have to solve this simple puzzle, logic puzzle. And if they both get it right, they get 6 euros. Okay, most people can find the right figure in this schema. So they are told, you're gonna do this paired with somebody else. If you both get it right, you are gonna get 6 euros. And then everybody was asked to choose who they wanted to play this game with, who they wanted to be paired with for this activity. And the alternatives were an Italian who works in a supermarket, or an Italian or immigrant who likes to, who either watches TV or is a teacher. The idea here is obviously that the teacher should be preferred over someone who works in a supermarket, doesn't matter their ethnic identity, because that's, the teacher is likely to have the type of skills to solve this type of problem. And indeed, we did find that the teacher is chosen, like 30% higher likelihood of being chosen for the competence game over anybody else. And immigrants are less likely. And if we look at the interaction of these two elements, we do find that there is no distinction whether immigrants watch TV or Italians watch TV. They're really not likely to be chosen. Being a teacher is a boost for both immigrants and Italians. The interesting thing is here is that actually Italians get a higher premium for being teachers than immigrants. But in both cases, signaling that skill is enough to greatly improve chances of being chosen and trumps the fact of being an immigrant. Okay, so what we got from these, in general, from these three games was the fact that essentially when given the opportunity to choose, people like show discriminatory behavior when actually paired in specific interaction settings involving trustworthiness, people don't discriminate. Finally, the last piece of ideas we test is that essentially having been exposed to immigrants before and having had positive experiences and having them in your friendship networks, acquaintanceship networks, workplace, and so on, might favor the likelihood of being positive about interactions with them. And indeed, this is actually the case. Here, I'm not presenting technical experimental results. Here are information that we gathered from our participants with respect to their, give me a second, there is something beeping. I'll be right back. Apologies. Okay. So here I am presenting behavior in the dictator game, the trust game, as well in choice in both the trust and competence game, as a function of whether our participants have immigrants in their friends networks, at least like 2 or more, in their acquaintance networks, work networks, whether they employ an immigrant or not, and whether they had negative experiences with immigrants. And especially friendship is a strong predictor of both treating the outgroup member better, trusting them more, but also choosing them in the first place. Now, obviously here I'm not assuming a causal relationship, but what I'm observing, which is consistent with the theory, is that people who had previous experiences in terms of exposure are embedded in heterogeneous social networks are more likely to behave positively and to choose outgroup members as partners. So to wrap up, what did we learn from this? So first of all, we did confirm the idea that economic and civic integration improves the perceived trustworthiness and competence of both Italians and immigrants. So like signaling market integration has a positive effect. We also learned when allowed to choose, Italians prefer to interact with other Italians. So there is a new group favoritism element in the choice component of the contact dynamics. But when pushed to interact with immigrants, Italians generally treat them similarly to how they treat co-ethnics. So once they find themselves stuck with someone from a different ethnic groups, they don't discriminate against. And finally, previous positive interactions, which are sort of crystallizing the networks, lead to greater willingness to interact with people. So how does this wrap up with my more general question, which was how does prosociality extend beyond in-group boundaries? So I started out with this idea that structural and institutional factors might push in order to individuals to experience intergroup contact. What we found is that essentially there is a persistence of in-group favoritism in selection processes, which is kind of consistent with the results from the audit studies that I mentioned before. So like there is consistency with a lot of empirical evidence. However, in purposive interactions in strategic games, people seem to actually treat outgroup and in-group members in the same way and walk away with overall positive experiences. And these might actually lead to lower resistance to outgroup contact in the future, which is essentially maps into the idea of like some sort of iterative process in which an enhanced frequency of interactions with outgroup members might contribute to kind of normalize experiences and be conducive to generalized prosociality. So essentially what I'm arguing for here is that we might, and we have observed greater prosocial behavior, even though there is a persistence of in-group favoritism in certain moments of a contact process, especially in the selection component. And how does this where does this go as a set of like ideas thrown there? This actually could simply explain what we observe at the macro level. Here I have an instance from Europe, but the same argument can be made for the US, but there is greater hostility toward immigrants in regions where immigration is low, while urban and multi-ethnic settings are generally more inclusive. So essentially, in some ways, what the evidence I brought up suggests is that indeed there is some positive effect of contact, which comes about in a context in which people are forced to interact with each other. So there is no idea here that people would actually overcome out-group boundaries independently based on their willingness, but structural forces might do that for them. Living in big cities, living in heterogeneous contexts. And once that happens, there is a dynamic that might take place in which people are pushed, they have positive experiences, they're more likely to select into outgroup members contact in the next round, and then they actually might essentially over time in a sort of iterative process develop like greater inclusive attitudes as well as behavior, which seems to be the case by looking at aggregate data. I'll end here. Thank you. Okay, you're muted.
Thank you, Delia. And now we have time for Q&A, and I'll serve as moderator, since you may not know all the people who are asking questions.
Sure, thanks. Let's stop sharing.
Okay. Well, Delia, let me then ask the first question. The field experiments you've done are very, very good in exploring what are the conditions that give rise to prosocial behavior outside of one's immediate ethnic group. But there is also a literature that could be tested in field experiments where there's a perceived zero-sum competition. This would say testing Edna-Bonash's theory of split labor markets, or Susan Ozak's account of segregating and blending processes, and the segregating processes have to do with competition over jobs and resources. So how might one build a field experiment that examines the effects of competition over resources, over jobs, over economic opportunities?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see your point. So in some ways, if I hear you correctly, you're pointing to the fact that in some ways, like the games we implemented were games that in one way or another captured interdependence and like the provision of some sort of collective good. While what you're saying is like in real world, as the threat hypothesis suggests, many intergroup contacts might occur under settings in which there is conflict over resources. And you're saying like, how do we test that in a game setting? I mean, one can definitely envision some games that capture, for instance, like coalitional behavior over scarce resources. At the same time, if there was some underlying threat happening, I would expect to see starker results in this context. So in the dictator game, so the dictator game just like shows how people decide to share resources, right? And if there was some hostility in terms of perceived threat, and therefore desire to keep as much as possible for the in-group, we would expect, let's say, Italians or a subgroup of them strongly favor the in-group member versus the out-group member. As I mentioned, a little bit of this is happening, but it's not a lot. It's definitely like, as you can tell, it's evenly distributed. So 20% do give more to a group and 20% give less. But the other thing is that the distribution is also not particularly skewed. This is an indirect answer to your question. The real answer is yes, great. We should try to think about games that implement that aspect of that type of like interaction settings that occurs. So in this case, you would actually probably want to take Italians that are probably at greater risk of being displaced by immigrants, like people who hold type of jobs that might actually be subject to like some competition from immigrants. You can think about some sort of competence game like the one we did before, in which the person who performs better might actually get all the money. So in that sense, there could be competition rather than like motivation to act together to produce a collective good. So you're right, like there is that element and we are not like directly capturing it. I would say from these dictator game results, I wouldn't really put much money on the threat hypothesis in this specific setting. But you're right, it's definitely something that could be pursued. The thing is that most behavioral games that have been developed and tested are usually measuring some sort of underlying trust and cooperation type of dynamic, less struggles. Because if you are like sort of like measuring conflict, you probably don't need to look at the interdependence of decisions so much. One thing I can tell you is that we did actually, and this is actually interesting, we could actually probably think about bringing this back. We had a threat game in the, we are not including in this presentation because it's not leading to any result that is different from what we have here. But in the threat game, people could actually, were in the situation of having some resources, and these resources could be taken away by some other player. And the player is indeed obviously either an Italian or an immigrant. So we do have a game that is not conflict over resources, but is a situation in which someone can come by and steal your things. So the threat game is a game in which you have a certain amount of resources and you can either like invest in an insurance, so pay for an insurance in order to keep your amount, paying some money, or just like trusting that the other person won't take it away. And we wanted to see whether people were more willing to pay an insurance when paired with an alter that was from another ethnic group. But we didn't have any result in that direction. So I don't know if this would actually fit the idea of like threat a la Odzak or group threat theory, but somehow it could, and in a simplified version. And again, we don't have evidence of discrimination.
But I think that you're right, that the looking for the basis of prosocial behavior in cities provide a huge clue about the prospect of blending processes being the dominant one, since immigrants concentrate in big cities. We have a question for Michael Macy.
Mute here. Yes, thank you, Delia, for a very interesting presentation. I'm thinking back to a study that I did long ago with Toshio Yamagishi and Koku Obara that was somewhat similar, where we had Japanese and Americans play trust games where they would or would not know the nationality of the person they were playing with. So it's very interesting, but and you know, like you, we also did a game situation, but I'm just wondering whether is a game structure the best way to measure this? I mean, an alternative, for example, and I'm just kind of curious to know what you think of this. An alternative setting might be a vignette of some kind where you have to decide who done it, you know, or you have to decide someone's who's guilty or who's responsible. Maybe you know, it's a traffic situation. Who's the responsible party? Who do we blame? So the idea here is to get at attribution, and to what extent would Italians make different attributions, either for giving people credit for success or blaming them for some kind of bad outcome, including a crime situation or a cheating situation, or even just an accident that happens, and in both good and bad. So it could be also a positive outcome, and to what extent do they who do they give credit to? And so that the vignette focuses more on attribution than on trust. Do you think you would get the same results? And why did you choose the trust game instead of an attribution vignette?
Yeah, so I am a behavioralist at heart, in the sense that I really believe in behavior before attitudes, although some part of me is studying public opinion and other things. But so essentially, I tend to distinguish between what people do in like everyday micro interaction settings from what people actually come to believe, which is partly a function, obviously, of the political climate, institutions, and so on. Now, I don't dismiss, obviously, the importance of beliefs, attributions, which is essentially like an important component of essentially building your relationship to alters identity in some ways. Like if you believe some ethnic groups can be as successful as your own, you'll be more inclined to be welcoming toward them than like having attribution dynamics in which you constantly downplay their success or their capacity to be successful, and instead like you give more, you tend to find them guilty and so on. So I totally see the importance of what you're pointing at. However, here we were really like into interaction dynamics. To answer your question, like there is another completely different research that I did with Jona and Max, in which we exploited the random allocation of refugees in Eastern Germany. Eastern Germany is an area where there has been essentially no immigrants, especially in rural areas. So these refugees arrived, and they were essentially randomly allocated to various localities. And we wanted to see whether the arrival of these refugees had effects on voting behavior, as well as like a bunch of issues in terms of immigration. And we also collected some attitudes that were about closer to what you are referring to, which is like attributional components like success, guilty, and so on. And we expected somehow what we did was to actually get sample people from communities that had received refugees and match them with people from very, very similar communities that had not received refugees. And the match was on all sorts of dimensions: socioeconomics, population demography, and also their previous vote for alt-right parties. And our expectation, our test was like, if you had received the refugees in your town, you might actually have change your opinion in one way or another, more negative or more positive, compared to people who had a certain opinion before their arrival and were in a very similar situation. And what we found is that we didn't find any change, both in the aggregate, like voting behavior, as well as individual behavior and attitudes, and in this case also sort of attributional aspects of a story. And what I learned from that was that actually in that specific case, at least, of people not being individually exposed to immigrants or refugees ahead of time, all their views were actually created through the political communication and institutional media system. So essentially, the people who were more extreme in terms of alt-right views became less extreme, and the people who were more left-wing inclusive became less. So they both became more moderate. Now, to get back to your question, my sense from what I learned there in general is that these type of dynamics that are more in the cognitive and side are strongly affected by the media communication environment. And it's real. However, like what I was interested in here was more in terms of how everyday interactions play out. And we know there is a lot of attrition between what people say and what people do. I know it's a stereotypical thing to say, but and that's the reason why with this set of activities, we really like went behavioral 100%. So I don't want to deny your the importance of what you're raising. I do believe that's more subject to different dynamics that are not like driven by exposure and indirect contact. And most of this belief comes from that that study that we did, which really led to no outcomes, no effect of contact.
Let's see, Emily, you had your hand up earlier. You still have a question?
Yeah, I do. Great, thank you for this talk. I'm curious, thinking about kind of back to the beginning of your talk and kind of basing your research around complex societies and big cities, and you talked about the looking at communities, parts of the city that were above average in immigrant composition, but I'm wondering if there's anything unique about those areas as far as the socioeconomic composition. Are they also likely to have more diverse incomes, or kind of is there like segregation within those communities? So trying to kind of broaden the notion of complexity to include some economic difference. And I just wonder how you've thought about that and what you might have to say about it. Thank you.
Yeah, actually it's important to say the level of segregation of European cities and Italian cities in particular is definitely not comparable to the level of hyper-segregation of the US context. So we did want to leverage variation in this domain, like being in a neighborhood that is diverse, but like high income could or could not be different and so on. We didn't have enough variation, to be honest. It's a matter of, and we have 1,000 participants, of which like 600 are Italians, but it's also really a matter of the distribution of people. Like we had this cut point, but most neighborhoods that were included were actually like among the richest neighborhoods. So there is a fair amount of variation in terms of, it is not only poor or lower middle class, so it's the bottom line is it's very important what you're pointing to. We wanted to leverage that. The actual setting of the city was not conducive to anything meaningful in this respect, which actually should speak to some scope conditions, obviously, of what we found and how generalizable, obviously, the research is. And obviously, the Lombardy region, Milan, is heavily industrialized. It's one of the richest cities in Europe, high level of quality of life. So essentially, there is also low attrition, low conflict. Although there are areas where actually like having like immigrant families move in might actually mean lower quality of welfare state and so on, not in terms of taxes, but in terms of resources going to different type of needs. But it's not as as strong as you could find in other contexts. So in that sense, it was a perfect setting to study interdependence in some ways. Like there is a need, like I lived in Milan, like I didn't look for an Italian nanny, but I very likely won't be able to find one, or people working in a series of other jobs. So in that sense, it's a perfect setting for interdependence with low threat, low conflict. In other cities, we find different things. Absolutely.
Let's see, Lisha Liu, you've been waiting patiently, and then after that, Varun Park.
Thank you, Delia, for this wonderful talk. So I'm wondering, like, how you think of the possibility that people would react to negative interactions with in-group versus out-group members differently. So the reason why I'm asking then is I saw your results. If I heard you correctly, you look at the influence of negative experiences with immigrants, and that has a negative influence on the dictator game and also the choice of partners in the trust game. So I think on the other one hand, the positive interactions, which like may commonly happen in the first interactions in workplace, because people were there for collaboration, right? The reason why they enter one workplace is they have a common goal to pursue. So then when like your research showed, and the previous research also showed that those positive interactions increases like it alleviates the bias towards out-group members. But on the other hand, I'm thinking, how would negative interactions influences in-group and out-group member perceptions differently? From my perspective, I'm thinking, is it possible that for like as a in-group member, when I interpret or rationalize the negative interactions with my in-group fellows, I would say, okay, we have a big group of in-group members here, and there are some negative experiences I had with them, but that's because they are very few and they are just the bad apples in the group. But when I saw maybe one or very few cases that is negative with out-group member, I would interpret it as a out-group member has this negative attributes. So I'm just wondering whether you have thought about it and tested, then was this the case? So thank you.
Yeah, this is a great question. This is actually part of a project with Maria Bascal, because it's a very important component of the story. So here, like the ambitious schema would be to essentially study how generalized trust develops. So obviously, it's not a one-shot type of experience, it's a bunch of experiences. So one thing that we are trying to do, again, using trust games, is actually to see in a series of trust games, having people play multiple trust games, how the behavior of the second person, the trust person that could behave trustworthy in a trustworthy manner or not, how the behavior of that person affects people's behavior in a new round of a game when they appear with somebody else. And if the ethnicity of the person they appear with in the first round has an effect on the impact of this experience, and it really goes in your direction. So if I am paired with an Italian and I'm betrayed by this person, that's not going to really change much my baseline consideration, assumption, stereotypes of what Italians do, because I am Italian. I met tons of them in everyday life. However, if I'm paired with someone from an ethnic group I've not been exposed much, the behavior of that person, either positive or negative, is going to have a stronger value in my sort of system in which I kind of stereotype. Is I kind of try to create types and expectations for people because I've not had a lot of exposure. So your intuition, I think it's right that the effect of a negative experience in this case could be higher when interacting with an out-group member. And the reason is, first of all, because exposure to out-group is by definition very low for native whites. Obviously, if you're an immigrant, things flip, like exposure to outgroup is oftentimes higher because you are mostly among non-coethnics. But yes, like if you are thinking in terms of native majorities, you are totally I think after the right intuition. We are running these type of experiments. I can't tell you, I mean, there is some evidence that this isn't the case, but it's super, like we are like steps away from saying this is a solid result. Psychologists would actually definitely support this in their theories. With respect to the data I have here, I'm not going to say much because essentially what I could expect is that if you have a negative experience or if you report negative experiences, you become the type of person who systematically tries to avoid contact with outgroup members. So like it's not going to tell us much with respect to behavior in games and so on, independent of selection processes. It's just descriptively confirming what someone would actually expect. Yeah, but thanks for the question. It convinced me that we should continue doing that research.
Aaron?
Oh, hi, Delia. First, good to see you. And yeah, I had a question which probably doesn't have an answer, but I wanted to, ask you about your opinion. So I think it's fascinating. So basically what you show is that it's really selection rather than the interaction per se that is driving these results. So it seems like we need some kind of, within ethnic, like incest taboo so that people reach out more and cannot select like the in-group. But I think these behavioral games, they are great, but they are also really just dyadic. But we know that people in the real world are actually interacting like in groups within broader networks. And from like these experiments done by social psychologists in the kind of identity theory, social identity theory tradition, we can flip a coin and they will just discriminate against each other by these group dynamics. So I was just wondering, like, how do you think about like how your finding generalized not to other like kind of settings, but to other settings in the sense of like when this happens within a group, like would you still expect that selection is the main mechanism, or would you put more weight into the kind of within group dynamics that can kind of also lead to discrimination and like yeah, discrimination, so to say?
Yeah, so we do have some work in this direction, in the sense we also played a series of public goods games with groups of 6, and we did vary the composition of the groups. These were actually in person, like that's why we brought in 6 people at the time. And in some settings we had homogeneous groups, either all Italians or whole Filipinos or whole Moroccans. In some cases we had, let's say, 5 Italians and 1 Moroccan, 4 Italians and 2, or 3 and 3. So what we found in this case, which is kind of funny, but interesting and solid as a finding, I believe, is that people don't behave differently as a function of, Italians don't behave differently as a function of the composition of the group. They behave in a homogeneous group more or less the same way they behave in a heterogeneous group. Immigrants behave differently, they do other things. But actually, this is just a starting point, meaning like your question was kind of broader. And in that context, I think that there is a fair amount of research on like threshold points and so on. So the idea is like, how do you behave if you're in a group in which like 90% are in-group members and there is a 10% of outgroups, and how to behave in a group in which is 30% outgroup might actually be different. So it's not like the presence, but it's the size of a minority group in this case. And we really don't know much. We have a sense that sometimes like thresholds matter, sometimes like the size of our group matters, because probably of what Victor was mentioning before in terms of perceived threat. In other cases, I like a lot this study in which they dropped people in, they essentially started a league in a Middle Eastern town, and they had homogeneous soccer teams and heterogeneous ones, and they just like made them up. And it is like people were going there to play soccer. So literally they didn't care. The finding is they didn't care who they were in the team with. And that did actually had long-term consequences on their willingness to like form ties with people of different ethnic groups and so on. So in this sense, I would say like there might be settings where like this size doesn't matter too much. And you get used to play certain sports with a certain type of others, as well as leisure activities or jobs for the matter. So it's kind of a confused answer, but the point is, it's true, we might expect different dynamics because we move from like dyadic to larger. We might expect like size effects, threshold effects, but it's extremely hard to make strong predictions. And I see Michael raising his hands because I'm sure like he has experiments on thresholds. So he definitely has intuitions about this as well. But I think that it's a direction in which is incredibly important to move. The other thing is that if you take my my story kind of seriously, which is like a kind of interactive story, iterative, in which you start out with one and then like you have more, and then you just really don't make it, it doesn't make a difference. I think that it could actually happen organically. So if things happen organically, you start out with like a soccer team, but like where a couple of guys show up and then a few more come, you just like, it doesn't register as a threat in a way in which you might, if you end up like one day showing up at the field and all of a sudden it's all Peruvians. I'm saying Peruvians because Peruvians are very popular in Milan in terms of like taking up like soccer fields where kids were playing like till like a few minutes before, because they have their own leagues and so on. So like the bottom line is how these process unfolds in reality, in daily life. It does matter a lot. And in my kind of theory, it is indeed like this game between like our innate preference for in-group selection, which has the in-group as a default, and the forces that pushes us to interact. And the important finding there is, in my view, is that actually when people are forced to interact, they have actually, first of all, the right attitude in the sense that like they approach others the way in which they would actually approach their in-group members. And that happens like in my experience, but it also happens in many of these studies that I was mentioning, which people exploit randomization or inducing randomization in field experiments. And that's a positive, a positive aspect for the story. So like the two things might actually still present. So if you measure, if you do audit studies, you will always find in-groups, or you'll always find a certain level of in-group preference, because it's the entry point, and at the entry point, people would actually realize, like follow their instinct. But at the same time, like in everyday situations when they're pushed into it, same thing with subway riders. Like if all of a sudden, like all the subway riders are not of your in-group, like you feel strange. But if this happens incrementally over time, you don't even notice it so much. So that's another layer of complication, by the way, because you can do some things experimentally, but this everyday like summing up of experiences is very hard to implement experimentally.
Michael, you have a question?
You're muted.
Michael, you're muted.
Sorry. Okay, good. So yes, this is to follow up on Baram's question, which Baram, that was a great question that you asked, because we always should be thinking about the ways in which our behaviors are embedded in groups. But where you went with your question and Delia went with the answer is more on the group side of the immigrant. But I want to flip it over and suggest that that the behavior that people are that you're testing for, behaviors of acting in a way that's discriminatory or indicating prejudice, that these don't occur in an atomistic way where it's just me deciding in isolation from the rest of the world how to interact with this either other person or other group in the in-person game. Rather, we're embedded in networks and we have influences on us. And so your allusion to thresholds, for me, it's really the influence, not the threshold. So what do you suppose would happen if you ran this experiment where before you have them play the trust or the dictator game, they are shown results of other participants' behavior in dictator and trust games, and they're asked to either express approval or disapproval.
Okay.
And then they're told that, and by the way, after you play, other people will see what you did. We won't put your name on it, but they'll see what you did, and they will be giving approval or disapproval, so that you have this awareness that your behavior is being looked at, and you could then manipulate who the people are. But I would start with, you know, it's your in-group that's going to be judging your behavior, and so my hypothesis would be that when you embed people in their in-group, and their in-group is monitoring and their behavior is subject to in-group influence, you may find more in-group effects than when people are acting outside that context.
Yeah, I mean, I think you are definitely right. And there is already empirical evidence in this direction. In this case, is just dyadic behavior. It's a Habiramayana and others set of experiments that they did in Uganda. They had a version of a dictator game in which the ethnic identity of a person would be revealed. So the alter would actually be able to tell whether the giver was an in-group or not. And this was the only setting in which they could find in-group preference. In this case, you're suggesting something broader, which scales up in terms of like your in-group is watching, and is not only the other person, but is other people from your group. But what I'm saying is like you're definitely after a very plausible hypothesis, because there is evidence in this direction, even simply when you look at two people paired in the dictator game. So I think that's a very important aspect of the story, and this actually is, this kind of observations belong to when some psychologists, at least, like they try to get into policy suggestions in terms of how to de-escalate conflict and so on. And for instance, like what you're observing will go in the domain of like trying to like decrease the importance of identity, exactly because the simple belief that your in-group is watching might actually like lead to behavior that is not like, that is detrimental for the greater collectivity. But this is actually more on the normative side and so on. But like it's very important to look into these aspects, because they could be also part of how you intervene in situations in group dynamics. So yes, this is a smart, interesting idea for an experiment. Thanks.
Byron?
Do we have still time? Because I just had an idea that you might find.
We'll be flexible.
Okay, I just had this like random idea that actually leads back to Victor's idea as well, with the zero-sum game and competition. And I was thinking of your field experiments in Uganda, and maybe, you know, there might be a design that might be exploited. It's just from the top of my head, but still, like there you had this kind of where people elected democratically a person who can sanction other people in a public good game. right? So you give, for example, some people power to sanction others. And what if you would play a public good game iteratively? So you start with a group, like say, like no heterogeneity, all like the same kind of ethnicity, and they play this game where they elect a person that has the sanctioning power, and they start with that. But then you add outgroup members, like little by little. So when the outgroup members like increase, they will gain like a little bit more power, and maybe it will kind of affect like the kind of the perception of how much power they have to control this game, which would create a threat, and where you would have then kind of this competition between groups and see how people kind of behave in this game, or after the game, how their attitude changes. Do you think that would be kind of a realistic kind of way to implement this idea of competition?
I think that people like who are sort of like people are interested in public goods games would actually like be worried about like having greater size of a group and so on. But I think that actually there is so increasing the size, because it might actually in itself change some of the dynamics. However, obviously you can control it with a situation in which you increase the size of the group with in-group members. I think that you're after something super interesting in the sense that there are two, like when we set out to think about, okay, when you have heterogeneous groups, what do you need more? And probably our first answer was like more institutionalized control, because some of the like diffused shared norms like peer control might actually fall apart. So in that sense, what you're proposing is extremely interesting, because the other dynamic in which we would actually say you need more centralized control, meaning like in this case an elected sanctioner, is when you increase the size, like collective action story, like when, as long as, if a group is small, you can like figure it out like using peer-to-peer technology somehow, but if you increase the group, then you need the state, you need the police, whatever. Political science type of theorizing. So what you're suggesting here is like to combine the two aspects. And I think it's actually very relevant. It would be quite complicated, but it's definitely, I mean, I can see how many like different angles through which this type of results could be interested.
Yeah, I mean, I thought actually the main reason for proposing this design is because, you know, especially with immigration, usually, you know, the perception is there was an in-group. Yeah. And then, you know, that like there's an order into which, like, you know, people don't come just together heterogeneously. It's like there's one homogeneous group and then another group is like added to it. So there's this kind of order component which kind of creates this kind of like perception of threats that, and the perception that it's like, yeah. And so, yeah, the idea was like this kind of, you know, this dynamics where an outgroup comes in, so to say. It's like kind of mimicking it.
I see. And actually that would be even like nice to compare to a situation in which you start out just heterogeneous.
Yes, and you could also randomize like the ethnicity of these like people who are added. Like, is it new in-group members, or is it just like outgroup members, or is it like a mix? So
it's just becoming bigger or bigger and different. Yeah, that's very nice. I like it. I mean, again, like there are issues with like changing the size of public goods games, number of participants, but yeah, it's lovely. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Delia, for giving us such a stimulating and engaging presentation, and we appreciate it very much. And we've run out of time, so I'll send you an email though after the talk, sharing some similar results from New York City.
Wonderful. Thanks so much to everybody for sticking with us. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.